Okay, welcome everybody. This is the week 10 instructor meeting. Housekeeping wise, we have the next exam starts tomorrow. That will be exam 4. It will cover the material in the Unit 4 study guide, so the things that we've talked about last week and this week, mainly business organizations, franchises, shareholders, and securities. That will start tomorrow. It will be open through Tuesday of next week. And it's the same format as all the other exams have been. 25 multiple choice questions, and you will have 2 hours. And again, it's open book, open note, open internet, not open classmate. Other housekeeping matters, this puts us about 2/3 of the way through the term. There are 6 total exams, including the final. This was the 4th of 6. If you're worried about your grade, if you're worried about how well you're doing in the class, let me know, please. I want to be able to help. We can work things out. It's a tough class, and this is the point. It's getting nearly too late to start if you want to try to make up and catch up. There's still time if you're hovering near that C range. There's still time, but let me know what I can do to help. I'm happy to help with those kind of things. Material-wise, let's start a little bit and talk about the duties of the board of directors and officers. Remember, the board of directors don't work for the shareholders. The board of directors are in what's called a fiduciary relationship with the shareholders of a corporation. That is, that they put the corporate interests above their own interests. And there are several duties associated with that fiduciary position. The first one is the duty of care. They're obligated to make decisions in a careful manner. They're obligated to not be overly risky in what they do in regards to the business. Certainly the same care that they would take with their own assets or their own opportunities. Next is the duty of loyalty. And this is that they put any business interests ahead of their own. The example the book gives is if a director notices an opportunity to buy land with mineral deposits on it for mining, perhaps. The director has a duty to, before he goes and buys the land himself, he needs to inform the corporation of it, give them a chance if they want to buy the land to do that. So that he also needs to avoid conflicts of interest. If the corporation is entering into a housing development and they're wondering where to put it, and this director happens to own a lot of land that's available, he needs to disclose that and not lobby and try to push the decision in such a way that will benefit him. Now, that's the duty of loyalty. Excuse me. Pardon me for this. Next is the business judgment rule. This protects directors from shareholder actions in certain cases. Most business decisions, when to give a dividend, how to invest corporate assets, new product lines, investments, those kinds of things, the business judgment rule dictates that the decisions need to be made with the best information and following the best practices of that particular industry. To use the mining example again, if you're trying to decide where to purchase mineral rights, you can't just go out and you'll buy them anywhere. You've got to go through the process that's common in the industry. So you need to have an expert probably survey it. You need to have whatever, I don't know what tests they do for mines, ground penetrating radar or geological surveys. You need to talk about the transportation, the infrastructure, whether it's there, whether the land is subject to liens or subject to other uses, whether it's a national monument, something like that. So you need to make those kinds of decisions in a prudent and in a manner consistent with how they're made in the industry. And if that's done, the shareholders can't come and question that decision. So if you exercise in your best judgment, the best judgment of the directors, decide that no dividend will be issued to stockholders this year, stockholders can't come back and challenge that if the decision is properly made. So that's the business judgment rule. It shields directors for their negative results of their actions. Say the mining land, they make the decision correctly under the business judgment rule, but it turns out to be unprofitable. The business judgment rule shields them from lawsuits and liability for that decision that didn't work out. So that's one other shield that the directors have, as long as they're exercising their fiduciary duty and making decisions using the duty of care. There are some other things about shareholders there, starting about page 380 something or other. I'll let you read through those. We'll move on a little bit to securities. So what is a security? A security is debt issued by a corporation, and it can take several forms. It can be what are called notes, and those are basically IOUs. They're promissory notes. And they can be secured or unsecured, but businesses can issue those in order to raise funds. They can issue bonds. You've probably heard of treasury bonds or municipal bonds. Corporations can issue those as well. They are, you pay me $20 to get a bond, and I will pay you $20 at 4% or whatever it is in 5 years. They mature after a particular time. And then there are what are called equity securities. That's the broad name for stocks and things that are like stocks. So we'll get to that in a minute. We talked about common shares and preferred shares. There can be various classes of stock. Preferred shares get priority in dividends and at time of liquidation and things like that. But other things can be securities as well. And here's a big exam hint. If, for example, on the exam there were a question about a farm offering sponsorship of a cow for a particular amount, you get a say in what happens to the cow in the company, and you get a share of the profits of the corporation. And if that hypothetical question asks, is that cow a security? The answer is possibly yes. So a cow can be a security. Remember that for the exam. There's your hint for the day. Moving on, we have securities regulations, and these were established primarily as a result of the Great Depression in the early 1930s. Congress established the Securities and Exchange Commission via the Securities Act of 1933. And what that governs is the issuance of new stock by corporations. And it sets the ground rules for that. Primarily, you need to register to issue the security with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then there are various restrictions on advertisements and various restrictions on who can invest based on the experience of the investor, based on the size of the offering, and things like that. If you have any questions about those, let me know. I'm not going to go through all of them in this meeting, but know that they're there starting at about page 415 in the book. Certain securities are exempt by the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, from their regulations. Small public offerings, up to $50 million. That's small. They don't have to follow the full regulations that the other offerings have to follow. There are regulations as well for certain startups and tech stocks that were put in place in the 1990s. certain IPOs. The Jobs Act as well permits crowdfunding. You may have heard of Kickstarter or some of those sites. Those are allowed, and they don't have to conform with the Securities and Exchange Commission regulations. Even though they're offering what may be a security, you'll get an interest or product or part of the profits if you invest. There will be probably one question on one of the rules on page 420 and 421, 504, 505, and 506. And these just things that are regulated by those rules are the types of issue or type of corporation, the types of investors, the size of the offering, and so on. Keep in mind there are a couple, when you're talking about the types of investors, what it means are accredited investors who are experienced, they know their way around, they're not going to be fooled. Non-accredited investors are just everyday folks. They're not experienced in securities law, and so they are given more protection by the Securities and Exchange Commission than are accredited investors. A violation of the Securities and Exchange Act of 1933 can result in civil liability for the officers of the company. So they can be fined civilly. Deliberate violation can result in imprisonment as well. That's explained on page 422 to 423. So there may be a question on the exam about this as well. What type of penalties can be imposed for violations of the Securities Act of 1933? Next act we need to talk about, and I know we're rushing through these, the Securities and Exchange Act of 1934. So 33 wasn't enough, apparently. No, the difference is the Securities Act of 1934 regulates the sale of existing securities. Rather than new securities as are regulated under the 1933 Act. The main thing to know about the Act of 1934 is the reporting requirements. So your company exists, it's already trading stock. The Act of 1934 wants to inform potential investors of the financial condition of your company before they invest in your stock. And so it's primarily concerned with reporting. There are annual reports called 10K reports that your company needs to file about profits and losses, the current financial condition of the corporation. There are also quarterly reports that have to be filed that are called 10Q. They're much the same. The annual report is audited, so it needs to be independently audited. The quarterly reports aren't, so they're just kind of a quick update on how the company's doing. So you'll hear, earnings calls for public companies. Microsoft will have an earnings call, and they'll say, "This is what we project for this quarter." That's part of their quarterly report, their 10Q. The current report, called the 8K, is a report on kind of the internal workings of the stock of the company. Any suspensions of trading, anytime we revalue assets, any big financial change will trigger the need to file an 8K report. And it must be filed within 4 days after a material event. A big stock buyback, a split, a large investment, a merger, an acquisition, any of those things will trigger an 8K, the requirement to file an 8K report. There are 22 different events. We're not going to go over all of them. I don't believe that's on the exam. Solicitations, insider transactions, and fraud. There are a couple of sections to be aware of the 1934 Act when we talk about insider trading. The first one is Section 16B. And this applies to the directors, officers, or shareholders who own more than 10% of the outstanding shares of the corporation. And what it prohibits, 16B prohibits them from engaging in what's called short swing trading based on information that the public does not have. So you're a director, you know that coming up you got a product release in 4 months. It's not public, but that product's going to be big. It's going to really help. Your stock's going to go up. So you're a smart director. You buy while the stock's low, and up it goes, and you make a lot of money. That's a no-no. You can't do that. That's a violation of Section 16B. What it is, any profits realized because of that kind of trade within any period less than 6 months go back to the corporation. So if you do that as a director and you make a profit within 6 months, you can't do that. The corporation gets your profits back because you used information that was not public to make a quick gain. And so they want to make sure the directors aren't doing that. That's part of the fiduciary duty problem. There's another regulation called Regulation 10B. This applies not just to officers, directors, and shareholders, but anybody who gains inside information. You can't trade based on that inside information to make a profit or to avoid a loss. You may remember the Martha Stewart case. It's probably been 10 years ago now or more. She went to prison for insider trading. She was not a stockholder. She was not an officer. She had nothing to do with the company whose stock she traded. She got a tip from a friend that the stock price was going to fall, and she sold her shares while they were still high. So you can be guilty of insider trading and not have anything to do with the company. You do need to have access to information that is not public. So someone who is very experienced in the industry, who is going through all public data, everything above board, all publicly available information, and makes a good trade, is not guilty of insider trading. There'll be a question about this, particularly on the exam as well. You'll be given 4 choices, which one of these is not guilty of insider trading. So any use of public information is fine. Any use of those quarterly reports, the annual reports, the AK reports, any experience in the industry, any pre-announcements that have been made of products, anything public is just fine. It's when you get a tip from somebody inside that, oh, hey, this isn't going well, we're going to have a huge loss this quarter. That's when you get in trouble. So remember, anyone can be guilty of insider trading. Janitor comes along, picks up and takes insider information and uses it for trade. He's got access to non-public information. So 16B prevents the directors and officers and large shareholders from profiting from insider information. Rule 10B prevents all the others from doing the same thing. Anyway, so there will be at least one insider trading question on each of those sections, if I remember correctly, on the exam. Last bit, Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This was in 2002. This was following the Enron and that giant corporate failure where it turned out that Enron's auditing reports were being filed and said, everything's great, we have tons of money, just tons of money, and they had nothing. So they collapsed, funds lost money, everyone lost money, they were bailed out. Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act in response to that. Keep in mind, it's sometimes called SOX, S-O-X, or Sarbox. It applies to publicly traded corporations only, not to closely held corporations, not to small corporations, large publicly traded corporations. Those who list their securities on the stock exchange or file registration statements to offer an initial public offering, or they have more than $10 million in assets and 500 or more shareholders. So large publicly traded corporations. And one of the key things that it does is that it puts the CEO and the Chief Financial Officer on the hook. They have to certify and sign off on all of the reporting requirements of the company, subject again to criminal and civil liability. So it prevents them from just letting the company rot beneath them and walking away. That's the idea. But also there are document retention requirements. One of the big Enron things is they went to investigate and all the documents were gone, just destroyed. So Sarbanes-Oxley requires document retention for a period, I think it's 7 years. And if they destroy, alter, or conceal those documents, that results, that are needed by an investigation or by bankruptcy, they can be imprisoned for up to 20 years. It's the officers and directors. But putting them on the hook tends to make companies compliant because the directors and officers do not want to go to prison. There are also restrictions imposed on accountants and accounting firms that perform audits of these corporations. Term to know, I'm not sure if it's on the exam, but blue sky laws. These are regulations on securities at the state level. The federal government doesn't have a monopoly. States can regulate the issuance of stock as well. And many do. They require particular filings or paperwork or reporting requirements. So those are referred to as blue sky laws. So there are both civil and criminal penalties attached to both of violations of both of these acts, as well as Sarbanes-Oxley. But you can also, there's also common law tort liability. Things like fraud, illegal conversion of funds, what do you call it? I'm forgetting the term. Embezzlement, that's the term. These are torts as well, and you can be subject to tort liability for violations of this. So there's criminal penalties, there's civil tort liability, and there are civil penalties within those acts. So there's a lot of potential damage, a lot of potential liability for directors and officers who violate these standards. Let's see, let's take a look here and make sure we're not missing anything. Tombstone advertisement, I'm going to let you look that up. Basically, it's when you're issuing a security, a tombstone advertisement. You can advertise the security before it's available to purchase, but the tombstone ad dies at a particular date. So it's a temporary advertisement for the purpose of preparing people to buy your stock. It's in the book, and I don't have a question on that because it's a pretty esoteric subject. But I think that brings us to the end of the review stuff for the exam. I will make the exam tonight and post it so it will be ready to go tomorrow. Good luck. Good luck with the exam. If you have any questions before then, let me know. Anything you want me to discuss at next week's meeting. And again, if you don't feel like you're doing as well as you'd like in class, let me know. I've had a couple of students contact me, and I'm happy to help. There are tips and things to try. Often, I'm not sure if BYU Idaho has tutoring this semester. They sometimes do and they sometimes don't. But you can look for a tutor as well in the tutoring office. But let me know. We can work things out. I know some of you, aren't doing as well as you'd like. I'm happy to work with you. Anyway, have a good night, and thank you for watching.